Hi Renuka, hi Bhavin. Thank you so much for coming onto the podcast.
Thank you for having us here.
Thank you so
Um,
much.
yeah, I was just speaking with a friend and I was telling them how this podcast has been quite some time into the making. And I'm very happy that we're finally getting to do this. But as is the tradition and as is what I've learned from our friend Amit Verma, I want to start this podcast with understanding a little bit about both of your histories, your backgrounds, your interests. So, Renuka, why don't we start with you? We all know of you as a cross-disciplinary economics person, if I can use that term, who studies law, economics, and society. But what I am interested in understanding is that how did you come to where you are right now? You clearly had various roles to play at various institutions. You've been at the at least to me legendary finance research group. You've been at ISI. You are at NIPFP. So can you tell our listener you were at NIPFP? So can you tell our listeners how you got interested in economics in the first place and how all of these places impacted you to get to where you are right now?
Sure. I started economics in undergrad, and the goal at that time was to become a journalist. But because of the honors program at the St. Xavier's College in Bombay, I understood for the first time what research is, because we had to write research papers for various college events or for the honors program. And I discovered in my undergrad that there was something called as a deeper product that you could build. You could spend many months just thinking about a particular subject and finding out everything that you could about it. And so that's how I started getting into research. And then one thing led to another. I worked on pension reforms at a very early age. It's very ironic that when I was in my 20s, I was thinking about pension reforms. And that got me excited about academia and policy together, because you could do research, but you could also start thinking about how it applies to the real world and the impact that it can make on various choices. And I've always been quite fascinated by how the world works and the role that we play in it, and how we can make it for the better. And so that's how the journey started. I always wanted to do research. Uh, the one thing that was very clear to me about myself was that I wanted to do research. So there was never any doubt about that. So I went on to do my PhD and came back to India, because, again, I always wanted to work on policy relevant questions in India uh, while being in India. So did not want to make a career working on India while living abroad, because I felt that being closer to the issues gives you a perspective that being further away doesn't. I mean, that's my view. And so I came back, and then I was at the Finance Research Group in ISI, as you mentioned, and then at NIPFP for a while. And all of these places were just fantastic in the kind of exposure that they give you. ISI to the world of academia, and FRG and NIPFP to the world of policy. And it it again helps you see the intersection between research and policy. So policy, why good research is important for how we think about policy, how we think about the various choices that we have to make, how we think about the impacts that these choices might have, and um, what how we might do course correction in the future. So I think I come from a world where all of these questions have to be backed by research, and that's what led me to where I am now.
And as you mentioned, you've been at a couple of places with various like varied work and varied kinds of atmosphere. But what I'm interested in understanding is that why Trustbridge, and we'll get to that later in terms of Trustbridge's mission. But for you personally, why did you think that you wanted to be here, and what is it about the work that you do here that drew you here?
I think it was the overall mission. So when I met Karan and Akshay, who co-founded Trustbridge, and I was the first person to join Trustbridge. So there was the attraction both of the mission, because my work over the last 15 years had showed me or had indicated to me that the regulatory apparatus is extremely important in how policy outcomes eventually unfold. And so, as economists, we are very used to thinking about the bigger picture and to think about how X causes Y. And very often we gloss over the institutional details of how X might cause Y. So, for example, there is a flood, and you might write a paper on whether XYZ relief impacted consumption outcomes post a flood, right? But how that relief actually reached people, what is the law under which that relief was actually given, what is the state machinery that brought the relief from the state to the particular district, who in the particular district is responsible for actually taking the relief to the people, what impact does this have on the fisc, how is this financed. So there are a lot of these plumbing type of questions that I thought that economists miss, and Trustbridge was a unique opportunity to marry the economics with the law, especially as it pertains to regulation, which is what I had begun to be doing in the NIPFP for the 5 6 years before I joined Trustbridge. The other attraction was that I had an opportunity to help build a institute from scratch, because as I said, I was the first person to join Trustbridge, and so there was this opportunity to shape the vision, the mission, the kind of culture that an organization might have. And all of these things were also exciting to me from my own growth point of view. So there is the growth as an academic and as a researcher, but there is also the growth that you might have as someone who knows how to build institutions. And I think it was both these that was very attractive about Trustbridge. And of course, I when I met my co-founders, I thought that they had it right, and so this was a good um, partnership between people who come from a very different world, a practitioner world, and me who came from an academic world. And there aren't many places where these two different worlds could actually, meet and understand each other and learn about each other's worlds. And I thought that that was a great opportunity as well.
Completely makes sense. And we'll get back to the genesis of Trustbridge and how two experienced corporate lawyers founded and thought about this very intense regulatory research institute. But Bhavin, over to you. And I think I'm particularly interested in understanding your career progression because it's very interesting. And I've written this down, so I want to read all of this. You're a lawyer by profession, but you've spotted a lot of hats. You've been an in-house counsel. You worked at a law firm. You helped students prepare for law school entrance exams. You worked as a partner at a legal tech services firm. You've taught at NLS, and now finally you're a program director at Trustbridge. In fact, if there is any jack of all knowledge here, it's you. So, can you decipher your trajectory for me and our listeners?
So I can try, and there's a couple of job descriptions that aren't on LinkedIn, and therefore, consequently, not in what you just um, read out. But I think if I were to try and make some sense out of this and put a wrapper around it, it would be to say that I've always been interested in some combination of law, education, and technology. And at various stages, each of these has been present in different proportions. When I started out at the very beginning, I was an in house counsel, and of course, the law part was probably the most prominent. I was fresh out of law school, there was a lot I had to learn, but even then, I had the chance to work with somebody who would let me experiment with technology and how it might help the in house processes at the organization that I was a part of. The opportunity then came after a couple of years to join an exciting startup that a few friends from college had started. So, law school tutorials then morphed into Rainmaker, and the education bit started to take a little more prominence then. I think it's always been this interest in trying to get at some of the foundational ideas of our legal system, of how it works, why it works the way it does, what was the thinking behind designing it, and trying to see whether it still makes sense in the contemporary world. Those have been common themes for me. And like I said, the manifestation of those themes may be in one of these three ways. I think all of it happily came together in the last couple of years and has been very, very fulfilling at Trustbridge as well, where I'm able to do once again all of these three things. So I'll pause there and see if there's anything else that I can unpack.
No, I think it makes sense. In fact, not as wide as you, but I've been also accused of being a globe trotter, for the lack of a better word. But I mean, I had I studied in a military school, so I wanted to join the army. Then I did my undergrad in physics from DU, so I wanted to be an astrophysicist. And then now I'm a lawyer, but I tell people whenever they ask me what I do, I tell them that I'm a lawyer for now, because I don't think it's my final career, and I don't think that that's how people should think about these things as well. For all we know, I might be out of a job in 5 years, but because of AI, not because of other things. But I think it completely makes sense. And for all that we know, this is exactly the kind of work that the world that we're going towards, world that one person won't be defined or should not be defined by just one kind of work that they do. I want to now go back to Trustbridge's genesis because I remember when I was in law school, which is not very very long ago. I remember one of my friends was working as an RA with Trustbridge, and that's how I got to know. And it was so interesting for me to see, oh, this is a new research institute. It helped that the website was very easy to figure out. It was attractive. The mission was very clearly stated, and since then I've been at the margins observing Trustbridge. And what was one of the other things that was very interesting to me was the fact that it's been founded by two very seasoned corporate lawyers, which seems counterintuitive in a way. Akshay and Karan, both of them have made so much money, but then at some point in time they decided that they want to focus their energy, or if not their energy, at least their capital, towards building something good. And maybe I'll record with them at some point in time later. But of course, the tagline for Trustbridge is trying to improve rule of law for businesses in India, because that's a very pointed problem that Trustbridge is trying to solve. But can you explain to our listeners, as much as you think of it, as much as you have heard these two talk about it, what kind of gap was Trustbridge trying to fill when it came into
So again, like you said, you should really do a podcast with the two of them, because they will be able to best explain their motivations. But the discussions that we have had internally, and we continue to have these discussions about who we are and where we are going and where we want to go. I think that what we all find is that businesses in India are hobbled by lack of rule of law. And while you might think that businesses themselves are misbehaving or breaking the law, the fact of the matter is that there is a trust deficit on both sides. So the state always thinks that the market is out here to cheat, and everybody is a chore, as we say in India, sab chore hai. And policy making starts with the presumption that sab chore hai. On the other hand, the markets are mistrustful of the state and think that the state is probably here just to extract resources from you. And what this does very often is that every party or every stakeholder is trying to solve the immediate problem, saying, oh, there is this trust deficit or there is this bad law, and how can we get around it to solve the problem for today? But that does not solve the deeper problem, that how should the law have been constructed in the first place, and after it has been constructed in xyz manner, how should it actually be implemented? Because when we talk about the rule of law, it is in both, right? It's in what constitutes the law, how have we arrived at it, and how is it implemented after we've sort of reached an understanding of this is what the law is and the law should be. And I feel that the gap in India is that this sort of apparatus is broken, that very often the law is badly drafted, the law is badly implemented, the adjudication, we've talked often about how there are problems of enforcement and adjudication, and then all of this bubbles back into each party mistrusting each other and each party misbehaving, and the cycle just gets worse. So in 1991 we had this big liberalization moment where we went from the license raj to a slightly more market oriented economy, and we've seen the gains from that movement. But I think for the next frontier, what we need to now do is dismantle what we might call the regulatory raj. And it's non trivial, because dismantling doesn't mean throwing it out, because then where are you? So when I say dismantle, I mean that you have to think from first principles what that regulatory environment should be, so that businesses can thrive, more money can come in into India, more entrepreneurship can take place. People today who are not able to start businesses because the cost of capital is too much, or the regulatory hurdles are too much, or you actually need deep pockets to navigate the bureaucracy that is India. If all of these things go away, then we actually have the potential to grow at much faster rates than we are growing now. And I think that it is this understanding of the core problem that India confronts today, that is the genesis of Trustbridge.
As a
Maybe I can
follow up,
just
yeah, please.
I just want to say two things and happily tag on to Renuka's response. So the first thing is to say that while it's certainly important to ask what's distinctive and unique about the organization, and every organization should ask such a question of themselves. I think it's also important to recognize that for a country this size and for an economy this size, there are precious few people working on the problems of law and economics and the problems of the economy, and we could do very well to have a lot more people join this space. And so in that sense, I think there's still a lot of work left to be done. It isn't hard finding a gap or a niche, and I would think that anybody who's interested in this intersection should just jump in. That said, for me personally, I think the rule of law framing is particularly evocative. It's not something that I've heard talked about or discussed or described in the context of other organizations as much. And aside from all the things that Renuka already spoke about, I think one of the things that this sort of framing allows you to do is to think about what is the sort of institutional structure that the country needs. What is the sort of makeup? What is the sort of um, mechanism that the economy needs in order to prosper? And this takes you away from any kind of requirement to subscribe to any kind, any specific kind of economic ideology. It doesn't require you to think in terms of one extreme or the other. It requires you to ask the questions of what are the basic enabling factors that we need. And that for me is a very, very rich, evocative idea, particularly as somebody who studied law.
Completely makes sense. And I want to double click on the idea, because the assumption that we're running with is that it's a good thing that businesses should thrive and it's good for the economy. And it's interesting that you said that there are certain set of rules or certain set of must have factors in terms of rule of law that, irrespective of the economic ideology that you subscribe to, will be good for people. But I would assume that if you're running with the assumption that businesses should thrive, we are kind of subscribing to a free market theory in the broadest sense that I could put it. But before understanding why is it that we want to subscribe to that theory and the kind of outcomes that it can benefit us with, can you tell our listeners and explain to them why is it important that businesses thrive? We have figured it out that there are some bottlenecks that we're trying to solve, which we'll get to later. But what is the good that comes out of when businesses thrive?
I think, Divyanshu, the framing to my mind is freedom. which is that what is the environment in which individuals are free to do what they wish to do as long as it does not impinge on others. And of course, it's once you start getting into the details of this, it's a very difficult statement to unpack. But if we just go by the bigger picture, then the question is that if I want to start a business or engage in an activity tomorrow, and if two consenting adults want to undertake a certain transaction, then they should be free to do so. And it is only when you have an environment when consenting adults are free to take up the transactions that they wish to do so is when the economy will thrive. Because each of us has a view of what the needs of the economy are and what our skills are and how we might offer our skills to serve those needs, to serve ourselves, right? And I think that's what, at least to me, where I mean when businesses thrive. So business doesn't always mean big business. It just means any kind of business and any kind of transaction between consenting adults that is of course lawful. And so that's what certainly I mean when I say businesses thrive. And why that is good for the economy, because all our creative energies, all our drive is towards that goal. And when that happens, then human societies flourish.
I mean, I completely subscribe to this idea, and I'm guilty of trying to identify as a libertarian. But when I think, as a follow up to this, I would like to ask you this question. We figured out, Renuka's laid the groundwork for why businesses should thrive and it's good for everyone. And we also discussed that we understand that there is a bottleneck of businesses not being able to do that. But can you contextualize this problem for our listeners with the help of an example or certain recurring regulatory problems that you've seen which impede businesses from growing?
Sure, happy to take a try at that. And the reason I say try is because there are just so many examples rushing through my mind right now. It's a little difficult trying to put my finger on one. We've all heard stories about the proliferation of compliance laws. And I think in particular areas such as running a factory, for example, I'm sure anyone who's ever picked up a newspaper in the last 20 years would have seen enough stories about how there are literally hundreds of compliances that one has to manage. And a failure on even a trivial point could carry a severe penalty, which could extend even to criminal incarceration. Now, this is not the sort of thing that encourages anybody to start a business in the first place, leave alone give them enough time and mind space to be able to run it without having to worry about impinging upon some law that they're not even aware of and facing the possibility of spending 6 months or more in prison. Now, that aside, I think another set of concerns that we've been thinking about and which I've encountered in my work in the last couple of years has been, it's one thing to say that there are all of these hundreds of laws and you're worried about breaking them, and breaking them could carry severe penalties. But what if you don't even know what the consequences of your action might be? So one would hope and expect that the law is knowable, it is consistent, and if I take a particular set of actions, I would know in advance what the consequences of those actions might be. But having seen, for example, the way that some of our regulators control the sectors that they are responsible for, and the inconsistent manner in which decisions are taken, the differences that are adopted, even though situations might be similar, it becomes hard to say with any degree of confidence that this is what is going to happen if you do X or Y or Z thing. For example, we've studied, as you know, a bunch of regulatory orders in the securities markets. And we've seen, for example, that for very, very similar sets of actions, the sanctions that are imposed on people can be dramatically different. We've seen that when sanctions are imposed in many instances, the regulator hasn't bothered to make out all the elements of the applicable law. And so I think that's one egregious example, right? So without going into any particular sector, these are the sectors that we worked with. I think one of the biggest manifestations of this problem is that if you're trying to run any sort of economic activity, you can't even be 100% sure that what you're doing today is legal or not, and what sort of problem you might encounter just because you did something in the course of your business.
It completely makes sense, and I
Devanshu,
think
I'd like to add just, so Bhavin's described things on the adjudication side, but even on the legislative side or the policy side, right? There are issues such as SEBI one day coming up and just banning commodity derivatives in certain products without really telling us why, without there ever being a large analysis of why is it that you're taking such an action that is going to affect the livelihoods of so many people, or the multiple actions that the Reserve Bank of India has taken, let's say in the payment space with regards to prepaid payment instruments. And we have a piece on that on the Leap blog, where we've looked at the different regulatory changes that might affect the incentive of somebody trying to start a PPI business. Now, you could argue that PPI is not a very useful product, because why would you save money in a wallet and lose float on it? But that's the choice of the consumer. And if a product provider finds enough consumers who for some reason don't mind doing this, then that is not the regulator's prerogative to decide what is a good product and what is a bad product. Let the market decide. If the market feels that this is not a good product, then it will be driven out of the market anyway. All you need to guard for are questions of consumer protection and fraud. And so there are multiple such instances across the financial landscape, for sure, because that's something that we know more than other sectors, where you see that the regulator intervenes on various questions without really justifying the need for that intervention, the consequences it expects from that intervention, and an ex post analysis, let's say 2 years, 3 years later, on whether whatever its objective was, has it been met, and if it has not been met, then should we not course correct? So I think that there are multiple such instances. In fact, there are so many such instances in field after field that once you encounter this, you can't go back and unsee all of this, right? And unsee the problem of the regulatory raj that I was speaking about earlier.
what I get reminded of when you say, when we talk about bad policies, and I think the jury is still out there, at least for most of the people, is the recent online gaming ban. Because when it came out for me, I in fact extremely dislike. I've always disliked these games, and I've disliked them because I just don't get the point of it, or point of them. I've never played them. I never want to play them, and I have had friends, or I have friends who've lost money on playing these games. But I remember when the ban came out, my first reaction was that it is up to the people, it is up to adult consenting individuals to decide what they want to do with their money. If this is what they choose to do with it, let them do it. I don't think the state um, should dictate what is it that adult consenting adults should do and not do legally. But of course, if you change the definition of what is legal, it warps the question. But I think now I want to move on to how things happen at Trustbridge. And this is again something that's been of quite some interest to me, because the promise of Trustbridge is not only that we will work at novel questions, or we will look at the same problems but in a novel manner. It's also the fact that we will leverage interdisciplinary expertise. And this is a very loaded word. We all hear cross disciplinary, interdisciplinary. But what does this mean? To the most basic explanation of that is that you have people from different backgrounds who figure things out together. So what I'm really interested in figuring out is that how at Trustbridge you have economists, you have lawyers, you have people from other fields. How is it that you manage to bridge the gap between each other's expertise, and how is it that you manage to effectively collaborate?
Okay, so maybe I'll start that question off, and for no other reason but for that, I am the newbie in this space. Renuka has been doing this for a while, and so perhaps my impressions are a little fresher. I think one of the first and easiest ways to answer this question is that collaborating across disciplinary boundaries gives you access to methods that you typically may not have been exposed to in your own discipline. And for me, one of the examples of that has been the way that we take on empirical research at Trustbridge. A lot of it is informed by methods that are very, very familiar to economists. These are quantitative methods, these are statistical methods, and while you do see these in legal academia, you don't see them as much as you do traditional doctrinal research. And so I think that's one of the first both advantages and perhaps ways to do interdisciplinary work, which is to explore methods from across the borders, as it were. I think the second big learning for me has been that if you want to do interdisciplinary work, you've got to challenge yourself to communicate ideas in ways that people from outside your discipline can understand, digest, make sense of, and work with. And as a lawyer, you'll appreciate that we have our own arcane set of words and phrases that we like throwing around, and this is why we don't get invited to many parties. But you've got to be able to convince somebody who doesn't speak 400 or 600-year-old Latin terms, and you've got to get them to agree, and you've got to get them excited about the idea to the point where they say, all right, now I'm going to take this forward. And equally, I think one of the things that working with people who've studied something different from you, one of the biggest advantages is that they'll think up questions and they'll ask you things that you perhaps would never have thought of asking. And sometimes this happens just because they're sitting outside and looking in, or because they have a much wider lens. Instead of focusing on what the particular interpretation of the third proviso to the fourth exception of a particular subsection might be, they're turning around and asking you what's the impact on this for market participants, and that makes you think in new and different ways. And so all of these, I think, are both learnings as well as ways and advantages of working in this manner.
And one more thing that I want to add to this is the good faith that people sorry, good faith and commitment to quality and honesty that people in both disciplines bring to the table. So when I'm trying to answer a question, and let's say I'm bringing the data to the table, then I have to be honest with what the data is saying. I cannot, there are always ways to mangle the data and get it to say what you want it to say. But I think that what works for an interdisciplinary in a setting such as ours is that we are honest to the methods that we bring to the table or to the discipline that we bring to the table. And so sometimes it is that I might have a preconceived notion about something, but actually when you see the thing from a legal side, you change your mind about it. And similarly, we hope that lawyers who come to the table, who've kind of been in a particular frame for many years, when they see the data or the economic way of thinking, so to speak, they will change their mind about it. And as long as you are honest to the discipline and to the idea of quality, I think that you can make a lot of progress.
I completely agree with this. And to me, the natural question is, of course, problems of state capacity, problems of how to fix regulators are problems that you can only solve in groups. For me, the question that I've been asking myself and struggling with is that I have I am a lawyer by training and I am interested in economics, but I am not trained in economics, and then which therefore guides the way how I think about a lot of these policy problems. So, how do you think an individual who you can assume is only trained in one discipline can comprehensively figure out, or not figure out, but comprehensively at least think about how these things can happen other than just reading up? Because for me, this is such a behemoth. I mean, I can read forever all my life but still not be even a good lawyer. So how do you think somebody who is from one field but wants to get a wider sense of understanding to especially these policy problems, like what is the way to go about that?
I mean, look, the best way, according to me, is to team up with people who have skills that you don't have, and find ways of working with them, because it's very difficult to learn the other field as well. And of course, the hope is that over time, as we keep doing these things, we will get better and better at understanding the other field and understanding our field as a consequence. Because now we see the same things that we learned in textbooks or the same methods in a different light, because we've got another perspective to the same thing. But that only comes by doing. So there are a few things, or actually many things in life that you only learn by doing. And this is one of those, that finding the right mix of people who come from these different backgrounds, but come very well versed with the methods in each, and grounded in the philosophy of each, and grounded in the view that we will apply the highest quality to whatever we do, and we will be ethical about what we will do. I think that once you have that mix, you can go very far. Right now at Trustbridge, we are largely lawyers and economists. And I can imagine that this will become difficult if we were to have people from fields such as sociology or anthropology. Uh, because the ways of looking at the world in these different fields are very different. And so you have to take that much more effort to understand each other. We will be richer if we are able to marry the way, say, economist thinks with the way anthropologist thinks, but it is that much harder to do. And so that's our endeavor, that we are able to work with people who bring a very different perspective to the same issue, and then figure out how we are able to convince each other and find some common ground so that all of us can make progress.
I want to just say one thing as a follow up, and this is partly in response to what you said, Divyanshu, and partly in response to what Renuka is saying. So I think the idea of teaming up with people is fantastic. We should all be protected from any kind of hubris which says that you have to necessarily learn both disciplines by yourself, otherwise it doesn't work. The magic lies in being able to work with people who have a different set of skills and knowledge and expertise from you. But that said, when you say that you've been trained as a lawyer, I think you'll agree with me that training definitely doesn't end at college. You're probably learning a lot on your job, and you'll agree with me that there's a lot left to learn. And so, at the same time, we shouldn't necessarily, I feel, particularly at the age you are, and I'll draw the uncle card and I'll say that. But we shouldn't restrict ourselves to a label that a degree sticks on your head when you're barely 22 or 23. There's a lot of time left, and there's a lot of time left to learn as well. So, there is hope.
I mean, that's the motivation I give to myself. So
I
there
would say
better
you
be hope.
shouldn't do that even when you're 40 something, yeah. There is
But
still a lot of time after the 40s also. Bhavin, I would like to think.
yeah,
That's what I tell myself as well. So,
we're all telling ourselves something at the end of the day. But just as a continuation, this because this has got me interested. Renuka, what do you think, if it's possible, that lawyers have taught you that you now think differently because of your interaction with lawyers? And the same question for you, Bhavin.
I think one is how an idea can actually get translated into practice. So you might say that, you might come up with a particular policy around, let's say, monetary policy, and how interest rates should be set up, or how you might want to have an inflation target. But what is it that the law should say for you to be able to actually achieve a certain process by which inflation targeting is done, for example? And so then that now starts to involve things like, what should the composition of a committee be, what should the process be, for how some things are arrived at, what are the checks and balances, is the word that most lawyers use, in ensuring that no one agency has control. I think those are ideas that are very powerful and have helped me think about the difficulties of a lofty policy objective and how it actually gets translated. And the law is a very important tool in how you might want to translate some of these ideas, and how you write the law therefore becomes extremely important in find it becomes the channel through which many of these objectives can be achieved. So I think that is one of my biggest learnings by hanging around with all these lawyers.
So I think for me, one of the biggest learnings from hanging around with economists and working with economics has been that it makes you think about the world in a way that a traditional legal education doesn't. And even though I'm lucky to have received a pretty good legal education, it's still now over 2 decades old. And so I think justifies the label traditional. As lawyers or as law students, we tend to think of the world as some sort of mechanism to hold up this superstructure of rules. I mean, the world only exists so that rules can exist because that's what we work with and that's what we know. But the big thing that I've learned from economics has been that economics is only superficially a discipline about things like finance or the economy or markets or business or firms or any of these things. At its heart, it's a discipline that really tries to understand human behavior in particular contexts. And adding that lens to studying law has been very, very valuable. And so it teaches you some things. For example, to back away from the knee jerk reaction that the only solution to a problem is enact a new law or change something in the law or impose a sanction. You learn, for example, that sometimes the best reaction might be to not do anything at all because human beings will sort it out among themselves. And that's not something that comes to you intuitively as a lawyer. So, adding that particular set of ways of understanding human behavior has been, for me, one of the most valuable things.
I mean, I fully agree to the fact that not only is there a need to think laterally and horizontally across disciplines, I do think that if you don't do it, you run the risk of only looking at half of the puzzle, and that's not going to allow you to solve, not even solve, even understand what these problems are. And problems of policy, especially, are very, very complex problems. I think for me, that was one of the biggest revelations when I started to think about policy, when I started to talk to people about policy. And in fact, every day when I think of, as in when I think about it, the one thing that I understand is the sheer complexity that these problems pose, and therefore which justifies the existence of something like Trustbridge, where people from different disciplines come and try to figure a problem out. And I think that's the best we can do. We can just try to figure it out. I don't know if you, me, or like even our grandchildren can solve a public policy problem, but that's the hope. Now I want to shift to particular work that Trustbridge does, and at least for this episode, I want to focus on regulatory state capacity, because state capacity is almost my favorite word. I like to use it. I like to understand it, and in fact, when I learned that word, it was I was too happy to learn it, because I was like, this is exactly what needs to be solved for at least most of these things to get better. And in fact, and I'll link this in the show notes for our listeners, I've recorded an episode with our friend Ajay Shah on not regulatory state capacity, but in general state capacity. So to refresh my and our listeners memories, can you tell our listeners what is in specifically regulatory state capacity, why should we care about it, and why did Trustbridge look at regulatory state capacity and regulators and not courts?
So let me start with the last bit of this question, which is why regulators. Because much of economic activity today in India is governed by statutory regulatory authorities. Not to say that large chunks of the economy continue to be kind of governed by what ministries do. For example, labor laws is entirely a subject that is run by ministries. The education sector is entirely a sector that's run by ministries. So, not to diminish the traditional government structure, but much of the modern financial markets or electricity markets, food markets, uh, are governed through statutory regulatory authorities. And these SRAs have come to play a very important role in the economy. And SRAs are unique because they are like a new branch of government that we had not studied earlier, or we had not thought through about in as much detail. And that's an issue that has come up not just in India but across the world, because you have now these complex structures or complex institutions that seem to be doing everything, or if not everything, then a lot of things, where they combine various functions in one agency and they are not directly accountable to the people. And this then causes a lot of problems or has an impact on the way markets function, and which is what we talked about earlier, right? In terms of transactions between consenting adults. And that's why we felt that regulators and regulations was not being studied as much. It had come to become very important in the Indian economy, and therefore by improving regulatory state capacity, we would have a lot of impact on the way the economy is functioned and on how the rule of law plays out in India. And so, therefore, regulatory state capacity, I think courts are also extremely important. But we decided to focus on regulatory state capacity for this reason. And I guess regulators combine both quasi legislative and quasi judicial functions. And that's where also a lot of the combination of law and economics comes into play. Because how you design the law, what are you designing it for, what is the impact you expect it to have, are all often dominated by the economics of the problem. And regulators deal with it all the time. And therefore, we felt that that was sort of something that we could bring to the table in being able to understand all of the regulatory functions, or rather, all of the functions that regulators undertake. And that's why regulatory state capacity.
Um, that makes complete sense, and I was this is a discussion that I remember having the first time last year with some of my juniors from Jindal. At least last year, when I was more optimistic about things, I thought I'd do like a a bigger study with the CCI, something that we discussed.
Divyanshu, we have to have a separate podcast on why you are not optimistic anymore. You
No, no,
can't
I
give
am.
it
I
so
am.
soon.
I was just more optimistic. But the conversation I was having with my juniors was exactly on what we discussed about how, I mean, given that I'm an antitrust practitioner and CCI is also a quasi judicial body, um, a study like this to understand the regulator, the impact that regulatory orders have had on the industry is something that we would like to do. And I completely agree with you that not only is this ill studied, this is also a very low hanging fruit, in which if you figure out and solve very low hanging fruit problems, the impact can be more than what is the effort that goes into solving them. At least that, hopefully, that it's that. And thank you for bringing out the quasi judicial function, because my next question is exactly on that. And I think this is a story, at least that was told to me by Ajay in our conversation, about how, at least among the regulators, SEBI was still is still a kind of a mature regulator in some senses, and at least in the fact that it's been around for quite some time, and it has by now managed to figure at least its basics out. And the story goes about how initially SEBI had combined both the judicial and the executive functions within it, and I think it was Dr. Sahu who had first figured it out, who spoke about this being a problem, and very interestingly, Ajay laments that he was not the one to figure this out. But it's a very interesting point for me, especially as a competition lawyer, because as you would know, the Competition Commission of India, even though it has a separate wing which does the investigation, it's still the term that we use, and what is also used in law, is an inquiry conducted by the CCI against an enterprise. CCI has the function to investigate, and it also has the function to award damages or impose penalties. And this is quite different from, say, the FTC in USA. The FTC has to bring its claims to court. It has to sue enterprises that it thinks have engaged in anti-competitive practices. So there's a very clear separation that you do your investigation, the court will handle the adjudication. Can you explain why is this separation important in the first place, and what happens when this separation is not observed? Bhavin, why don't you start with this?
Sure. So let me try and take a stab at this and try and explain it in the simplest way that I can, because that's the way that I began to understood this concept. So I think we shouldn't stop at saying separation of powers. Separation of powers by itself tells us very little. All it says is that you should assign different functions to different institutions or different sets of people. Problem starts to happen when you don't have enough checks and balances, or when you have a concentration of powers. Right? It's when these same powers, even if they are with different people, are all housed within the same institution, for example. And that's what you start to see in SRAs, or statutory regulatory authorities in India. So the sort of problems that this leads to are very Kafkaesque and very obvious. The first one is that there is a complete lack of accountability. The second is that you might be tempted to use your power for reasons other than those that the law gives you those powers for. Let's take the case of a hypothetical SEBI officer who joins the organization as some sort of young novice in the investigation department. It's quite possible and perhaps even probable that in some years they graduate and they move on to the adjudication department, after which, again, in some years' time, they are in policy, they're framing regulation. So it's not as if you just have the problem of law making, investigation, enforcement, and adjudication in the same institution. It's more often than not the same individuals who play each of these roles from time to time. And then your incentives start to get a little warped. If you're an adjudicator, you're likely to be collegial towards people from the investigation department and take a kinder view of their allegations than if you were somebody who's sitting completely outside the institution. Those, I think, are some of the more obvious problems that arise from this. I think the downstream impacts of this, or the wider ripple effects of these, are that you don't end up getting the sort of regulation or the sort of rules that allow a regulated sector to flourish.
Renuka, what do you think about this?
No, I completely agree with what Bhavin is saying. And one of the things that is understudied is the impact that this lack of separation has on, the downstream effects of the lack of separation of powers. So whether it is the fact that adjudication is broken, but then how does it impact the economy? Why do we care that all three powers are housed within the same organization? Of course, we care because in some ways the principle matters to us and it's important in and of itself. But the other reason to start caring is to say, look, this has some adverse effects on how the economy then begins to function, or what kind of firms do you see, or what kind of entrepreneurship do you see, what kind of economic activity do you see? How much ability do regulated entities actually have to go and stand up to something that the regulator is doing? And very often we find that regulated entities in India do not stand up to the regulator because there is too much power with the regulator. And if I take the regulator to court, for example, on some issue, it might be that there might be effects on the licensing side, or on some other activity that the regulated entity might perform, on which the regulator also has control. So this diminishes the value. uh, yeah, so this of the what the regulated entity can speak out against, and therefore it diminishes the economy as well, because nobody is going to speak out. And one way to measure this is also to say what effect does it have on those already in the market. And those already in the market have probably figured out how to deal with the existing status quo. But it also has an effect on all of those people who choose not to come into the market because it's just too difficult and it's too onerous. And that's something that's really hard to measure. So I think that one of the things that is of interest to us at Trustbridge is to demonstrate how this concentration of power actually has downstream effects on the economy, on livelihoods, on GDP growth. It's very difficult to find causal connections like this, because as you can imagine that if the impact is on entrepreneurship that does not happen, then there is no way to measure the entrepreneurship that did not happen because of this. But that's really the endeavor, that we need to begin to ask questions around the impact of this on all our lives.
And I think what is also a little bit difficult here while studying regulators, and my next question is what does it mean to study regulators? But I think one of the things that, at least to my mind, makes it difficult to study regulators is the fact that these SRAs, as you mentioned, they aren't permanent bodies. They keep changing all of the times, which of course even courts do, judges do change, even maybe with a larger tenure. And maybe the correct analogy here is that benches change, and the same matter can be heard by different benches. But here the composition of the regulator changes from time to time. And one of the or in of not even one the only factor that allows predictability when it comes to courts is the fact that if there is a decision that has been handed down by a court, that becomes the answer to your legal question, which is the principle of stare decisis. That principle does not exist with regulators for the most part, from what I understand and I know of. Can you tell our listeners how that makes it difficult for you to study regulators? Because you can do all of the statistics, which in fact can even lead you to outcomes where there's no trend, because different compositions of regulators go in equally different directions, and then there is no trend in the first place. But even if there is a trend, the fact that the composition will change and it is not governed by stare decisis, it can actually
I
again
think,
go
Divyanshu, the
anywhere.
first way to study this is to measure this, right? Which is, as Bhavin was alluding to sometime earlier in the conversation, that similar issues end up with different sanctions. And why is that? And to what extent is a certain decision that was taken 5 years ago Uh, being repeated, or similar circumstances are leading to completely different decisions? I don't think we know that. It's not been established. We maybe we have a lived experience that tells us this, and which is why we are saying it, but I don't think that there is documentation or measurement of the fact that this actually happens, that regulators are in fact taking very different decisions on very similar subjects, be it sanctions or be it something else. And so the first way that you study any phenomena is first to measure that phenomena. And in fact, Bhavin will tell you that this precise question is something that has gotten us very excited at Trustbridge, because we did a lot of work on SEBI and we did a lot of work on electricity regulators, and the basic measurement that we did in terms of what regulators were doing around sanctions, for example, told us that actually similar things are leading to very different outcomes. And similarly, if you start looking for whether they cite themselves, we find that many a times they absolutely, there is no mention of the fact that this similar issue was discussed n years ago and this is what the regulator thought at the time. And I think the first step that we are taking is to measure that there is actually a problem. And I suppose the second step would be to again ask the question, why does it matter? Because if it didn't matter, and if every question can be asked afresh and there is no consequence, then what is the problem? Right, it does matter for a particular, actually for various reasons. And I think the second step for us would be to demonstrate why it matters, why is it important to have something like a precedent when it comes to regulators. And the third thing would be then to say, how can we get regulators to start taking precedent more seriously? That's the way that an interdisciplinary team would sort of begin to approach this question.
So let me try and perhaps unpack each of the three stages of the problem that Renuka's talked about. And just as a recap, the first is there a problem at all or not? Measure it, identify the extent of it. The second is to ask why it's important and what sort of undesirable consequences does it lead to. And the final part of that is then to say, all right, if there is a problem and it's leading to undesirable outcomes, then how do you go about fixing it? So the first part, as Renuka said, we've started to study this, and we now have at least the beginnings of an idea of how deep this problem might be. So one example is when we studied SEBI's insider trading orders over a 15-year period, we find that in 87% of the orders, precedent is not cited at all. So a SEBI adjudicating officer or a whole-time member will nearly 9 times out of 10 not base their reasoning or decision on prior decisions. But in 13% of instances, they do cite precedent to justify their outcomes. Now, you can't have it both ways. You either have a system that forces you to be consistent or you don't, but you can't at convenience decide, I will wear the suit of precedent today, but I will wear a completely different outfit tomorrow because it suits me. And this makes intuitive sense, but you've got to probe a little more. And that takes us to the second part of the problem. Why exactly is this an issue? And there are perhaps just two or three ideas that I'll throw out there. There are many more here. But I think the first, most basic argument here is one of fairness. There's no reason that for doing the same set of things, Divyanshu should get a lighter punishment, Renuka should get a stricter punishment, and Bhavin should get no punishment at all. This is an idea that's probably at the heart of our constitution. This is an Article 14 matter, and this is at the heart of the concept of the rule of law as well. I mean, the most cliched framing of the phrase rule of law is the rule of law and not of men. And so you could reframe that to say the rule of law and not of adjudicating officers. So we don't want inconsistent outcomes in similar situations. That's one. The second idea to hold on to is discretion. How much discretion do you want in the hands of a regulatory official who, for the most part, I would dare say almost 99% of the time in Indian SRAs, has little or no judicial training or experience? The idea is that an adjudicating officer, a WTM, any other regulatory official exercising an adjudicatory function at an SRA is supposed to merely apply the law to the sets of facts that are presented before them. By allowing them to decide how they want to deal with certain facts in different ways every single time, you are giving them essentially the authority to make law through adjudication, which is not something that Parliament has given to the SRA. Parliament has given SRAs the authority to make law through well identified mechanisms of regulation making These are statutorily embedded. There are checks and balances, for example, laying procedures before parliament. And you can bypass all of these things if you allow rulemaking through adjudication. And so these are just some of the problems that might arise if you don't have a way to ensure that adjudicators at SRAs have to stick with prior decisions. And if they want a deviation, once again, there are clearly framed and identifiable rules for how a deviation can take place. All of these things are missing today.
I completely agree with the framing that, the multi-part framing that you just said, and also that it's important to figure out what are the consistent issues that are arising, and as we were discussing about separation of judicial function and executive function, this is a problem that's consistently been coming with Indian regulators, and arguably a little bit been solved at SEBI. To my mind, is still a problem at CCI, which is not yet been flagged um, sufficiently, and will hopefully, yeah, Bhavin.
So I'm going to push back on that one, Divyanshu. If anything, the need for separation has been recognized in something called the Competition Law Review Committee report, which we know about. Whether or not it's been implemented is a different matter, but at least conceptually, there is a different cadre of people who sit in the DG's office and who do investigation from the cadre of people who do adjudication. This is not the case at SEBI. And so I would in fact say that you're lucky that you're dealing with a regulator that in some senses is a little better than many others.
And may I add that we don't even know what happens in the case of the RBI because their orders are not published on the website. So all we get is press releases that XYZ was fined and XYZ was asked to not give out fresh loans for a certain period of time. Uh, there is absolutely no information available on the particular case and then why certain penalties were imposed and what was the defense. We just absolutely know nothing. So I think that if we all got together, just trying to complain about the sectors that we know, we could just go on for a long time and it would be a good competition to say whose life is the worst.
Yeah, and I think it's true that you don't value what you have. So thank you, CCI, for having at least a clear demarcation between these two. Um, you mentioned your work studying the securities regulator and the electricity regulator, and of course I'll link both of these work products in the show notes. I think and because that there is enough, thankfully there's an initiative by Trustbridge where you try to break down your own work, and there's a 3-part video series on in which where you're trying to explain the study that you did with SEBI. And for the listeners, what Trustbridge did was they looked at a specific subset of SEBI orders, which was insider trading orders for a specific range of years, and then they analyzed the performance of these SEBI orders at SAT. They looked at what happened to these orders. Were they overturned, or if they were affirmed? If they were overturned, what were the main reasons of them getting overturned? And the conclusion of this study is, a, of course, as we just discussed, what the aim was to measure if there is a problem. Then a problem was identified, that because of XYZ reasons, these SEBI orders are being overturned, and therefore this led to suggestions of, if this is a problem, if this is the main reason SEBI orders are being overturned, maybe that's how you should beef up your regulatory orders. Which is also, I think, the offshoot of this was the paper, How to Write Good Regulatory Orders, and we'll get to that shortly. But for our listeners, because for me, and I know we've spoken about this earlier, but to me, it's such an interesting thing what you've been able to do. So if you can, in a gist, explain to our listeners how you conducted this study using LLMs. What did you start with? What are the problems you encountered in the study? And why was the end result that you got? Why were you satisfied with that end result? And what did it tell you?
Okay, so maybe what I'll do is I'll talk about the methods and how we used LLMs, and then hand over to Renuka for some of the insights and analyses that we were able to pull out of this. Um, so we know there is a proliferation of adjudicatory orders that SRAs issue pretty much every single working day, and the SEBI is no exception. However, these orders usually aren't as neatly organized in legal research databases as superior court decisions might be. So, if you want to do any serious, meaningful, in depth study, the first step is to try and collect all of these orders. For us, the only route to do that is through the regulator's website, which we did. We then tried to drill down into the sets of orders that were final orders in insider trading matters. And we said, there is a set of things that we need to ask from these orders in order to be able to carry out our analysis. Some of this information was fairly straightforward. This included things such as dates and names. What is the date of the order, the show cause notice, who are the parties, what is the name of the company, so on. Some of these required us to dig a little deeper in order to be able to answer the question, have the elements of the law been made out? So we had to look at the insider trading regulation and we had to break it down into its parts. We had to try and identify a logical structure that linked them all together and then frame questions that would help us identify whether that information existed in the order or not. And we first tried to do this with a team of interns, with supervision, and so on and so forth. But we quickly realized that that wasn't getting us very far. Two people reading the same order may well come up with different answers. And it's very difficult to go back and recheck something because, people move around, the team doesn't stay consistent. And so you can't go and retrace your steps all the time. And so we started asking whether LLMs would be able to help us do this. We explored a few techniques which are now, I think, fairly common and well known. So, RAG really worked well for us, chunking a document down into its parts and then directing specific queries to specific parts helped us. We spent a fair amount of effort learning how to constrain LLMs and prevent them from giving verbose responses and restricting the responses to simple yes and no so that it could be as binary as possible, which would aid later analyses. But I want to say that I think the most significant thing that we did in this regard and what we spent the most amount of effort on was figuring out our verification process. So it's not as if we were able to use LLMs that did not hallucinate at all or that did not have any errors at all. Of course, they did. We were perhaps able to reduce the percentage of errors somewhat with prompting techniques, as anybody would. But we spent a fair amount of effort trying to figure out what is the margin of error, where are these errors likely to occur, and how do we go identify them and fix them. And so this entire process was fairly intensive, and it took us, I want to say, the better part of a year almost before we had the data set ready. And perhaps I'll hand over to Renuka now.
Yeah, besides the LLM, I just want to spend a little bit time on sort of thinking through what to ask the LLM to look for in the orders as well, because that's a very important part of the study. What is it that you're looking for? So, information like dates, name of parties, etc., is pretty obvious. But how will you judge whether a regulatory order does what it is supposed to do? And I think that's where we spend a lot of time designing the metrics that we want to extract out of the order. So that includes things like, what is the law that governs how SEBI should behave in an insider trading case? So that might be related to how you define who is an insider. That might be to do with what is an insider transaction. So, what qualifies as insider trading and what does not. That might be how you arrive at a certain penalty amount if you have if you have come to the conclusion that there was insider trading by this particular person. And so how do you frame those questions and how do you get answers to those questions was a very important part of that study. So, for example, the law says that you can be an insider if you are connected, deemed to be connected, or have access to UPSI. Now, it's important then to search in the order whether such an insider relationship has been made out in the order or not. Because if you don't make out this relationship in the order, then on what basis are you saying that I'm an insider and I should be uh, penalized? And so a large part of the study was really designing these metrics and finding the basis for why these metrics are the correct metrics to look for in an order. So that's one other big part of the measurement exercise that I want to stress on. And this brings us to the conclusions, right, or to the analysis, which is, if I have to just give a one line summary of what we found, is that 50% of the times when SEBI has imposed a sanction on you, you may or lose INSAT. And so then that begins to tell you something about the way SEBI is actually drafting its orders and whether it is able to hold its ground in SAT. And there are various reasons for it. Sometimes it is very simple procedural stuff that, show cause notice was not sent. This happens very rarely, but it has happened. Sometimes it's more substantive stuff, like an insider relationship has not been made out, or the relationship that has been made out is actually not an insider relationship. Similarly, we find that most insider trading cases now are not because people are connected, but it's because somebody has access to UPSI. Now, having access to UPSI is much more vague than having to prove that two people are connected parties. And then that gives you a sense of where the regulation per se on insider trading is going. And you can begin to ask questions on how is an insider defined? How is an insider trading relationship defined? And should we begin to ask questions? Because here is where there is an intersection of the legislative side and the adjudicatory side, right? The adjudicatory side is able to put out these sanctions based on a certain standard that is set by the legislative side, but that is a very vague standard. And you come back to the question of separation of powers and to the question of state capacity, because all of these things are connected. And so that was what we were able to find out from our study on insider trading. We've done similar work on electricity regulators as well. So one of our pieces is looking at the performance of 10 electricity regulators at Aptel, and the reasons why their orders are overturned or not, and what are the issues that go up to Aptel most of the time. And you see a variation that when it comes to Karnataka, it's a particular issue, but when it comes to Rajasthan, it's some other issue. And you can go back and then start to ask, why are these kinds of issues coming up in Karnataka, but some other issues coming up in Rajasthan or Maharashtra? And again, you see that the legislative and the quasi judicial side are coming together to help you reflect a little bit more on the state of the sector and on the state of the state capacity in that sector.
Now that you mentioned my favorite word, I think I have one more question to ask on this, because I think, at least from my reading of a lot of your work, after you identify the problem, and one of the solutions that you give to these very common regulatory problems is to invest in regulatory state capacity. And the way I understand it is, and I think it's also good segue into a short discussion on what does it mean to write a good regulatory order. But can you explain to our listeners what is the intention and the meaning behind the suggestion that these regulators should invest in their in their capacity? And what is it like? Do we mean that they should hire better people, or if they should hire more people, or if they should have a checklist that you should check every time they publish an order? What does it mean?
I think, to me, it means two things. One is, of course, the latter, that you hire better people, you train them. Very often regulators have no guidance on how they should write an order. There are no manuals on how XYZ things should be done. Uh, Technology today is very different from 20 years ago, and you could leverage technology to help you write some of these things better. So that's one part of it, which is really the skills that it takes to do your job well. But the other part of it is the incentive that you have to do your job well. So you may have all the tools in the world, and you may have all the knowledge in the world and all the skills in the world, but you may just not want to do it because you are shaped by certain incentives in terms of what the law is asking you to do, what your HR policy is asking you to do in terms of how you might get promoted over time, what public pressure is there on you to behave a certain way, what you see your role as. If you see your role as an adjudicator versus just somebody who's sending a signal to the market, and I don't care what happens in SAT. If I see my role only as someone who's trying to send a signal to the market, I will look at my role very differently. And no matter how good skills I may have, I may behave in a particular manner. So I think, to me, regulatory state capacity means working on both sides. One is just improving the tools and the skills that existing regulators have, but the other is to actually shape the incentives that the regulators will be forced to behave in something that we might kind of say is more rule of law appropriate.
And just to take that further, you don't have to think very hard or look very far for ways that might potentially improve these things. So, for example, is it at all a measure of your capability and performance how many of your orders are overturned in appeal? The answer today is no. So it doesn't matter to me whether or not my orders get overturned in appeal, and so I'm not going to bother even looking at what the appellate order says. Or are there ways to better design the institutions? We've briefly pointed to the US, and yes, some regulators in the US do not have quasi judicial powers, but some do. And so, how are they handling this problem? And very often, the answer is there is typically a separate cadre of people called administrative law judges who have both the judicial training required for the job and who are insulated from other divisions within the organization. And so, you can better design institutions, you can better design incentives to ensure that this happens as well. But maybe I'll just take a couple of minutes to elaborate a little bit on some of the suggestions that we've made. So, as Renuka said, nobody's gone around talking about what exactly makes for a better order. It's one thing to say that here are the substantive reasons why there is a reversal or some sort of modification in appeal. But what exactly is the structure of an order? What exactly should it contain? And how do you ensure that it serves the interests not just of appellate performance, but also of regulated entities, also so that even beyond the parties who are directly affected, market participants can predict the likely outcome of their actions? And so we've tried to do this, and we've divided our requirements into four broad categories. So, what is the information that should be in there? How should it be structured? How does it address the substantive law? And how should it be written in a manner that is easier to understand and easier to implement? And I'll leave it at that. We've got a whole paper on this, so there's a lot more. But part of the reason that I think we're deeply invested and interested in this set of questions at the moment is because we're at a point where you have a set of emerging technologies that could potentially help improve the situation in ways that were not conceivable even 10 years ago. So 10 years ago, could we think of checklists and templates? Yes, we could. And these are still powerful, essential, and I would say primary steps that people should take. But beyond that, if you are now able to use things like LLMs to extract all of this rich data from orders, can you then turn that pipe around and use these in some ways to say, all right, this is how you might augment the capacity of the human who is required to take these orders? This is how you could assist the human by, for example, surveying all the previous decisions that have been taken and identifying for them what the institutional position has been. Can you have some tool that can look at a draft potentially and say, all right, these are the elements that are missing and you should consider adding these? So in all of this, I want to be very careful in saying that the actual decision making is never taken away from the human, but we now have the opportunity to augment the capacity of that very same human in ways that we could not think of a few years ago.
I want to add one more thing to this, which we often don't talk about as much. We've sort of talked about the skills and we've talked about incentives, and we've only talked about incentives that are coming from the top, right? What is the law saying? What is my appraisal going to say? And how does that shape how I behave? But there is something called as a reputational effect, and hopefully there has to be pressure also from below, if I may use the word, which is that regulated entities, society, has to start demanding better. And one way that regulated entities and society can start demanding better is by being able to measure how well today's performance is. And the tool that Bhavin was talking about, right? The idea of using technology to augment how an order is written can also be used to figure out where is the order going wrong today, what are the pieces that are missing. And then if you start continuously measuring every single order that comes out, and you have a score for every order, and you have sort of some pointers saying this is where you're going wrong, perhaps that information then builds up an ecosystem and arms people like you and me and everybody else in society who cares about these things to go and ask better, because now you have the information about what is actually going on. It is just not my impression and your impression, but it is actually something that is measured on a regular basis, and that can serve to change the larger opinion of the regulated environment. And I think that we need to not miss out on this channel of change as well, because change will not always happen when it's top down. It also needs, there has to be a demand for change as well. All of us have to ask for something better. Only then are we going to get it.
Absolutely agree. And I think this is, I won't say it's a grouse, but at least another topic of discussion within at least me and my friends who practice competition law is that there are a lot of provisions of the act and a bunch of regulations um, are, or at least hopefully will be challenged in the time to come. And that's how the regulator will also be forced to draft better laws. And if not in a very linear sense, draft better laws, but more complete laws and regulations. And I think that, as you said, the regulated entities and us as a society as a whole need to demand better to get better results. Um, I just have a few generic questions to ask now in the last leg of this conversation, and I think at least these are very important to me because my question to both of you is to try to understand your worldview, because I think both of you have spent considerable time doing policy. It's not a popular career choice. In fact, a lot of people will say it's the wrong career choice. You don't make a lot of money, you don't get a lot of fame, but there is, I am assuming, a sense of satisfaction in doing and solving the problems that are closer to your heart. So, can you explain why is it that you left money and you chose to do this very arduous task?
I'm going to let Renuka go first, but I want to quickly jump in and say, who says there's no fame in policy work? Here we are on Divyanshu Dembi's podcast. It doesn't get any bigger than this. Um, okay, so all right. Since I've grabbed the mic anyway, I might as well go ahead and say, um, I think the money question is something that I encountered fairly early on in my career, and it isn't as if I had a very sanguine Zen-like response to it in my 20s or perhaps even in my 30s, because I saw classmates and friends, going up the conventional career ladder, and at some point trying to figure out whether they should buy a Beamer or a Merc, while I was still trying to figure out whether I had enough money for an AC two-tier train ticket. But I think the idea of satisfaction, of course, is an important one. But for me, one of the driving motivations has always been having control over what I do, having control over the kind of work that I spend most of my day doing, and the satisfaction of knowing that it will lead into some sort of measurable change, no matter how small, that I can see in my lifetime. Sometimes this is immediate and fulfilling, as for example, in a classroom. Sometimes the arc is longer, as with policy. But having these conversations is another measure of showing that this work resonates and people are reading and people are listening. So that for me would be the answer.
I was always in a career that made no money because I chose very early on in life to be an academic. And so, post my PhD, I was in institutions like IJIDR, FRG, and then ISI, and then NIPFP, none of which really are known to be useful for making money. And so, it was a choice I made very early on for similar reasons that Bhavin has laid out. That beyond a point it doesn't matter, because there's always a trade-off. While money does buy you freedom for sure, but lack of money also buys you a freedom of another kind. So while it's important to have some level of money for some comfort, uh, and each of us may have a different threshold for what that is, but anything beyond that, then you get tied to certain kinds of jobs that you may not want to do and may not be fulfilling, and may actually give you a burnout and health problems, whatever, because you are tied to the idea that you need so much to live. Whereas if you need less to live, then you are free to do many other things that life has to offer. And so, in some ways, I actually think that lack of money or lack of need of money buys you freedom. And that was a philosophy that I subscribed to many years ago, and that continues. And recently, because I work with a very young team, I have learned a new phrase called Dilulu is the new Solulu. And so I'm very delusional about how my life is just going to be okay and it's going to work out, and everything's going to be fine, even if I'm not very rich. So, yes, that works for me.
That is a very comprehensive answer, answered from very many different disciplines, if I can say. And I completely agree with you. In fact, I'm again reminded of a conversation I was having with Ajay Shah, and he had told this to me. And this is back when I was starting my career, which is 2 years back, but this is in 2023. One of the first things he told me was that we should learn to live frugally because of the same reasons, because it buys you freedom. And that's another lifelong, hopefully not a lifelong problem, but another problem I am trying to solve right now. But my last question, honestly, is a question I love to ask uh, people who I am speaking to, which is, what are the problems of the Indian state that you think are the most important for you, if not generally, and why is that?
I think for me, it is the fact that the state sees itself as, or state and society see it as sort of the MyBab, as the provider, and there is excessive intervention by the state in all facets of our life. And there is no recognition of the fact that this might be a problem.
I'll take a slightly different tack and say that for me, the problem of the way the Indian state is structured and the way it works has always been a problem of over centralization. And this is, to me, apparent in many different ways. There are the ways of state center relations, federal relations. There are the ways of examining who among the three canonical branches of government, the executive, legislature, or judiciary, has the greatest powers. And I think it's very safe to say that it's always been the executive. But for me, this is a problem that's only been getting worse in recent times. And one worries now that this over concentration is not merely in one branch of government or in one set of people, but rather in one person. To me, that is the most troubling thing about the Indian state today.
completely agree with these troubles, and I think that um, it is it is overly difficult to not try to first condense so many of these problems into concrete questions that we can try to solve, but it's also the fact that these are such massive problems to solve that I mean, the good part about this is that even if you solve 1% of it, the change can be very significantly, because these are such massive problems. But the other point and the other side of this is that you probably will never completely solve these problems. And um, as a popular saying goes, evil never dies, it just reinvents itself. So
So Devanshu,
um,
it ensures that we have jobs, no?
yeah, very important. And and Bhavin, I think my last question is to you. I saw you're wearing a Sakura T-shirt, and being a Naruto fan, the question I want to ask you is what is the ninja way of Trustbridge?
I think the ninja way of Trustbridge is show up, do the work, and leave the rest to fate.
That on that note, again, Bhavin, Renuka, thank you so much for sparing time on a Saturday evening to speak to me, and I hope that this conversation motivates a lot other people like me to eventually, or if not right now, move on to policy, and if not make a lot of money, at least be satisfied with the life that we're living.
Thank you,
Thanks
Devanshu.
so much. This has been wonderful.